Good morning and welcome to today's lecture session on the skill enhancement courses in English. I'd like to give you an overview about the skill enhancement courses that the CBCS has prescribed for English honors and general students. In the first session, I'll be talking about SEC1, that is the English language teaching course. And in the next session, I'll be talking about SEC2, which is creative writing. Both these courses are prescribed for English honors and general students. The English honors students have to compulsorily do SEC1 in Sem-III and SEC2 in Sem-4. Whereas for the general students, it's optional. They can select SEC1 in Sem-III and Sem-5, SEC2, or SEC1 in Sem-4 and SEC2 in Sem-6. So we'd like to start off with the course, English Language Teaching, SEC1. First of all, we have to define language. One of the simplest definitions of language is, it is a system of symbols that permit people to communicate or interact. Now, we talked about a system of symbols. Now, these symbols can include vocal and written forms, gestures, and body language. Another way to talk about language is in terms of the four basic language skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So when we talk about the teaching and learning of a language, or in this case, English language, we need to address each of these skills. And wherever possible, you should utilize activities which will integrate all the four skills, since each of these skills reinforces the other. Now let's look at the order in which we learn, or somebody learns these four skills. First of all, listening. When people are learning a new language, they first hear it spoken. Next comes speaking. So eventually they try to repeat what they hear. The third stage is the reading. That is, later they see the spoken language depicted symbolically in print. And finally, writing, where they reproduce these symbols on paper. Which means that when we learn a language, we need these four skills to complete communication. Now, these four skills are also known as four capabilities, because they allow an individual to comprehend and produce spoken language for proper and effective interpersonal communication. And in short, these capabilities are known or often called as LSRW. In the language lingo, language teaching arena, we call them the LSRW. Now, each of these four main skills now has some sub-skills and skill activities. The main skills are all basic and very important, and hence they are called macro skills. And macro skills refer to the primary, the key, main, and largest skill set. And further, these macro skills can be categorized into listening and speaking, which are brain input skills, and reading and writing are called brain output skills. Of course, along with this, there are other skills such as pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary, spelling, and all these play a major role in effective English communication. The second way in which we can divide these four skills are receptive and productive. So we talked about the four main skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And these four skills are taught or assessed in terms of these 4 skills. So listening and reading are known as receptive skills, while speaking and writing are known as productive skills. Now, listening and reading are called receptive skills because learners do not need to produce language to do these. They receive and understand it. Whereas speaking and writing are called productive skills because learners doing these need to produce language. So having a good English level means to understand and to produce the language. So we should teach and develop all the 4 language skills simultaneously to our students. Now let's talk about the concept of the skills. Trying to understand each one of these skills. What does it mean? Listening, meaning you should understand the main ideas of most speech in a standard dialect. You should demonstrate an emerging awareness of culturally implied meanings beyond the surface meanings of the text. In speaking, you should be understood without difficulty by natives and converse in a clear and participatory fashion. You should be able to initiate, sustain, and bring closure to a wide variety of communicative tasks. In terms of reading, you should easily follow the essential points of a written text. You should be able to understand parts of texts which are conceptually abstract and linguistically complex. Writing, you should be able to address a variety of topics with significant precision and detail. You should be able to write competently about topics relating to particular interests and write clearly about special fields of competence. Now, when we look at each of these skills, we'll first take a look at the listening process. This is one of the 4 language skills. It involves a sender, a message, and a receiver. It is a psychological process and it involves receiving message, constructing meaning from it, and responding to messages. The process of listening begins with hearing. Now, what is this? It is sound waves simulating the sensory receptors of ears. It's a physical response. And hearing is the perception of sound waves. You must hear to listen, but you need not listen to hear. Next comes understanding. Understanding is taking out the meaning from previous associations and successful interpretation of the message being received. For successful interpersonal communication, the listener must understand the intended meaning and context assumed by the sender. Third is remembering. Now, remembering or memorizing is an important part of the process of listening. It means the individual who is receiving the message has received the message, interpreted it, and added it to the mind storage bank. While listening, our attention must be selective so that ramble might be quite different from what was originally seen or heard. Next comes evaluating. Only active listeners participate in this stage of listening. In this, active listeners weigh the evidence, sort out facts from opinion, determine the presence and absence of bias, and then they start evaluating the message. And finally, we respond to the message. Now, in this step, the individual receiving the message sends verbal or non-verbal feedback to the speaker or sender. And this step allows the speaker to determine if a message has been received or not. Through feedback, the sender may determine the degree of success in transmitting the message. Next, we look at the speaking, reading, and writing skills in terms of its objectives. Speaking skills. The main goal of teaching speaking skills is to achieve efficiency in communication. Learners should be able to make themselves understand using their current level of proficiency. They should try to avoid confusion in the message due to wrong pronunciation, grammar, or vocabulary. The teachers can help learners develop their speaking skills by arranging balanced activities that combine language input, structured and communicative output. Now, language input comes from teacher talk, listening, reading passages, and language heard or read outside the class. Next, we look at reading skills. Reading is often said to be the most challenging skill to be introduced to children. It is most difficult and yet at the same time exciting skill to introduce. Reading is not a simple skill as it involves a combination of many skills and even cognitive abilities. There is no single foolproof method of teaching how to read, as every method has its own limitations. Once a child has been introduced to reading books successfully, there is no end to what a child can accomplish. In a nutshell, we can say that reading is a process of finding written words. Next, we come to writing skills and its objectives. Now, we mainly write to communicate with someone when often he or she is not present in front of us. We do a lot of writing simply to preserve something, for example, a piece of information, an idea, or even a memory. A teacher introduces young children as to how to write, as by the time they start schooling for the first time, they are already capable of talking with confidence with a variety of people on various topics. Now let's take up each one of these skills in terms of teaching that skill. First and foremost, teaching listening. Now, listening, as we said, is a very important skill. In fact, it is said to be the queen of the 4 skills, since it helps students to speak, communicate with others, and learn grammar and vocabulary. In fact, it is the first receptive language skill. There are a number of difficulties involved here. It is related to how many people are there in the conversation and how quickly they can speak. It is related to the inability of students to understand the listening text if they cannot understand the vocabulary. Now, when we talk about the stages of teaching a listening activity, we usually divide it into 3 stages: before listening, during listening, and post-listening. Now, before listening, what should we do? We need to prepare the students for the listening activity by making them interested with an interesting introduction to the topic. Give them a reason for listening, asking them a question to answer, explaining new words, and explaining some new structures. These are some of the things that we do to prepare the student before the listening activity. Now, what happens during listening? Now, students listen to the text for the first time. Helping them guess what will happen next after listening is again another part of the activity and a part of the text. They compare their predictions after their first listening. You can ask them some questions to answer before they listen a second time. Students now listen a second time, and they do some activities like filling in a table while listening the second time. Finally comes post-listening. This is where we check the students' understanding of the whole text by asking more questions on details. The teacher reads aloud the text, which could be a story from the audio script with 5 or 6 mistakes. Now we are going to talk about the techniques to teach reading. We divide it into the Kwl technique, which means what I know, what I want to know, what I learned. Now, in this technique, the teacher uses a picture or the title to ask the students to say everything they know about the subject they're talking about and lists their pieces of information. So this is what I know. Students then ask questions to get information about the topic they're reading about. The teacher accepts any questions that the students ask. This is what I want to know. Now, the teacher gives answers to the questions the students asked. The teacher lists these pieces of information. This is what I learned. The next technique is the DRTA technique, or the Directed Reading Thinking activity. In this technique, the teacher asks students what they think a story or text with a title like this might be about. Students then read part of the story or text. The teacher asks the students what they know, what they think now. Are their guesses right or wrong? The teacher asks students what it is in the story or text that makes them think this. The teacher then asks students what they think will happen next. Coming to teaching speaking, we divide it into problems and solutions. Now, this is one of the most complex skills, and it takes a lot. It's rather delicate how we teach this. So, some of the speaking problems and their solutions, I'm going to give you them. Some students are afraid of making mistakes. So what does a teacher do? You have to be patient and encourage group work. Correct only serious mistakes. Now, some students don't get a chance to take part in speaking. A teacher can speak to them after the lesson. Passive students don't participate in speaking. How do you solve that? They need help and attention from the teacher. The topic is not interesting to all students. What does a teacher do then? He or she moves on to a different topic. Some of our students speak very quietly. Encourage them to speak loudly. Now, there are about 6 activities a teacher should use in speaking. Students make sentences about themselves, that's 1. The teacher asks a question to one student, who in turn asks another student to answer. The teacher tells a learner to ask another question. The teacher asks a question and encourages students to give short, realistic answers. The teacher asks the students to give a response of more than one sentence. The teacher gives a real answer and asks the students to make a question of it. So these are some of the activities that someone can do in the class to promote speaking. Now, what about the techniques for correcting speaking mistakes based on the type of mistake? So, accuracy and fluency. Expressions of the face. Accuracy is expressions of the face, gesturing with hands, something like try again. Fluency is when we do not correct everything. Correct some, but at the end. List down the mistakes and deal only with common ones. Talking about teaching writing, there are usually the 3 stages to deal with writing, like in listening or speaking, before writing, during writing, and after writing. There are 4 steps before writing. Students get enough ideas and information necessary for writing. It helps learners to focus on the purpose and possible readers of their written work before starting writing. Grouping the discussion. Encourage your students to discuss a certain topic in groups. The advantages of this are, it helps students get different viewpoints. Stronger students can help weaker students. It helps the teacher to find out whether his students have enough vocabulary and are good at language structures. Then, sunshine outline. Students draw rays as though it is coming from the sun and write a question word on each of these rays, like who, what, why, etc. Help students think of possible questions that begin with these question words. Then they write a phrase or 2 to answer these questions. Then there is oral brainstorming, and this is done orally. It involves the use of questions. The teacher can write these questions on the board and ask each student to think about answers to them. The teacher should bear in mind that some of the points. Accept all students' answers. There are no right or wrong answers. Never force the student to follow your viewpoints. Never interrupt the students during answering. The teacher discusses the answers with these students. Then he asks them to go to the next step. Interviewing is another activity. Students interview each other. They share viewpoints and ideas. They usually share their personal experiences and think about them during the interview. This makes students relaxed and reduces the fear of writing. Now, during writing, the second point, there are 3 steps: drafting, revising, and editing. Now, the teacher tells his students to write on every other line of their paper to allow room for revising and editing, meaning they leave one line in between their sentences. The students write the first form of their writing. Students revise whether the content of their writing is clear or not, either in pairs or alone. Students edit their writing either in pairs or alone, and this time they focus on grammatical structures, spelling, punctuation mistakes that they might have in their writing. And finally, the students write the final form of their writing. Coming to the last point, after writing, this involves 3 steps. Number 1, publishing students' writing. The teacher encourages students to publish their writing in different ways. It can be in the classroom, in the school, the newspaper, or magazine. They can collect their written work in a classroom book. They can put it in the classroom or the school library where other students can borrow and read it. The second can be classroom discussion. Students can read their writing to the whole class, either in groups or in pairs. And this helps students practice listening to and speaking about their writing. It can be in the form of drawing pictures based on their writing. The students make pictures and they enjoy talking about it. Now let's talk about approaches. Some of the approaches and methods of English language teaching. In your CBCS SEC 1 syllabus, we have 3 methods or approaches prescribed for you: the grammar translation method, the direct method, and the communicative method. We'll take them up one by one. Now, the grammar translation method. This is a very old method and no longer used nowadays, and this method was used some 50 to 60 years back in schools. This emphasizes reading, writing, translation, and the conscious learning of grammatical rules. Its primary goal is to develop literary mastery of the second language. Memorization was the main learning strategy, and students spend their class time talking about the language instead of talking in the language. The curriculum requires the memorization of paradigms, patterns, vocabulary, with translation being used to test the acquired knowledge. So, in this method of teaching, the role of the mother tongue, or L1, is quite prominent. The students' role, the students are very passive receivers of the new information. The teacher starts the activities and directs them. Students are supposed to memorize the rules and the new vocabulary with their meanings in their native language. The most common vocabulary teaching technique is the memorization of long lists of vocabulary with their equivalents in the student's mother tongue. Grammar teaching is deductive. The teacher introduces the rules explicitly and wants the students to apply these rules to new examples and exercises. Students are supposed to memorize the rules. In order to explain the rules, the teacher uses comparison and contrast between the student's native language grammar and the target language grammar. So, translation is a common way to clarify the meanings of the new grammar patterns. Some of the goals that are used to teach translation, to read and understand literary text in the target language, is to make students aware of their native language structure and vocabulary, and to improve students' mental capacities. Students translate a language from the target language into their native language. And what happens in this is memorization plays a major role. But the primary skills to be improved, the challenges, that is, or the demerits, is the primary skills to be improved are reading and writing. Very little attention is paid or given to speaking and listening, and almost no attention to pronunciation. So this is the grammar translation method, which is now we consider outdated and no longer much in use. Next comes the direct method. Now, this also has its advantages, disadvantages. Now, in this method, the direct method, the adult second language learners can learn a second language in essentially the same manner as a child. Therefore, if possible, the teacher should create a very natural learning environment within the classroom. Instead of explicit grammar instruction, the major emphasis is now on communicating, which is a step above and ahead of the grammar translation method. And the classes are carried out totally in the second language with absolutely no fallback or reliance on the mother tongue or any form of translation. Now, the expectation is that through question and answer dialogues, the second language will gradually be acquired. A lot of problems have arisen in this with such an approach because adults do not in fact learn exactly like children. They express the need for explicit instruction and other aspects of the second language. Teaching of receptive skills like listening and reading rather than teaching of productive skills like speaking and writing was encouraged as a first step. Contrastive analysis of the native language of the learner with the target language was also done. Teachers were required to have a good knowledge of the phonetics of the language they teach because they would use it to teach pronunciation and not phonetics. So this was an extension. In fact, the direct method was born as a reaction to the grammar translation method. The grammar translation method cannot prepare learners for real life situations in which oral communications is in the media. Now, inductive learning is essential in the direct method, and there is a direct relation between form and meaning, whereas second language learning is very similar to first language acquisition, and there is a lot of direct exposure to the target language. So language here is used for oral use. They say each language is unique. There is a direct relation between the form and meaning. No other language should interfere when learning a language. Now, grammar. In the direct method, the grammar is taught inductively. Examples and drills are given. Students are expected to discover and acquire the rules. Drills like chain drill, yes, no question, questions that are used to help students to induce the rule. And the materials that are used are often real life situations, dialogues, plays, role play, etc. And in this, there is no role of the first language or the mother tongue. And the skills that are encouraged is speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Especially speaking and listening are emphasized. Vocabulary is over grammar. So you can see that this is a slight improvement on the grammar translation method. Now we come to the last of the approaches, the communicative approach. Now, this learning theory is that very little is known about the learning theory of the communicative approach. Activities that involve real communication promote learning. Language that is meaningful to the learner supports the learning process. This believes that language is for communication. And the goal of language teaching is to develop communicative competence, meaning using the language appropriately in social context is important, and communicative competence should be acquired. Now, what is language according to the communicative approach? A, the language is a system for expression of meaning. B, the primary function of language is for interaction and communication. C, the structure of language reflects its functional and communicative uses. And D, the primary units of language are not merely its grammatical and structural features, but categories of functional and communicative meaning. Now, what is the student's role in this communicative approach? Of course, the teacher's role first. The teacher in this approach is a facilitator. He or she is a manager of the classroom activities. He or she acts as an advisor and monitors student performance. What about the students' role? The students are the communicators. They are engaged in negotiating meaning actively. Students are responsible, and they're responsible as managers of their own learning actively. They interact, and there is interaction between student and teacher and student. And students benefit from group work, pair work, group discussions, project, etc. How about the grammar teaching in this communicative method? Each linguistic form has a function. That is what is told to the student. Grammar is not taught in a vacuum. It is integrated into the communicative aspect of the students. And what about the materials used? Authentic materials are used. Articles from magazines or newspapers, songs, short stories, advertisements, all that are used by native speakers in real life are used as classroom materials. Communicative activities like information gap filling, opinion gap activities, these are used to promote students' communication in classes. Pictures, visual aids, and realia, they are all very important to support meaning. So in this, the mother tongue has no particular role in the communicative approach. Only the target language or second language or L2 should be used during activities, but also not only during activities, but also when the teacher is giving explanations, instructions, and homework. Students are encouraged to see the second language as a tool for communication and not just as a subject to study. Now, what are the goals and objectives of this? To make students competent in communicating, being able to use, in this case, English appropriately in a given context. Students must know the different forms that can be used to perform a function, and one single form can serve a variety of functions. Error correction, there are errors during the speaking, but these errors can be tolerated since they are a natural outcome of the development of communication skills. Authentic materials are used. This is something we say. Role play is a very important aspect of this. It provides an opportunity to practice the target language in real life situations. For example, at the bank, at the post office, at the railway station, etc., etc. And what are the skills and language areas used? Language is emphasized over forms. The target language is taught at a supra-sentential or discourse level. Students learn cohesion and coherence. Conversation structure is the target language. And the 4 language skills are learned right from the very beginning, like skimming and scanning, reading and writing. In fact, what is now said is the communicative approach actually encompasses the grammar translation method and the direct method into it. And this is how we begin to teach. Thank you.